in the morning, beneath the stars so bright. Pull your hat down, make sure your cinch is tight. Horses kinda snuffy, cold chill up your spine. They'll get your ass moving, son, we're burning daylight.
Howdy there, I'm Matt McKinley and we're burning daylight.
In the saddle till the job's done right.
Welcome to Burning Daylight, the only podcast for the working cowboy. Well, howdy daylight burners. Happy Monday. I hope you guys had a good weekend. Everybody that's listening live, it's obviously Sunday, but I'm really excited about this episode. As you guys know, I've been, forgive the language, sir. I've been kind of balls deep in my research on the meatpacking industry. And one of the books I come across in my search was called Slaughterhouse by this gentleman here, Dominic Pacyga. Is that how you say your last name?
Pacyga, yeah.
Pacyga, okay. You Polish guys have impossible names to learn when when you're used to if you're not in that. I guess Polish, is it a Cyrillic language?
No,
it's not.
It's the Latin alphabet, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, they but that part of the world has some really difficult names to pronounce, but at least you're not all consonants, I guess. You do
not all.
So
we have difficulty pronouncing your guy's name, so
I believe it. But anyway, I read Slaughterhouse. It took me a couple weeks to get through it. I was pretty busy time, but I thought you did one of the best jobs I've come across on the meatpacking industry, because there's a lot of strong emotions one way or the other, and you get a lot of I won't say propaganda. I mean, I guess propaganda has a bad connotation, obviously, after World War II, but I guess more is a lot of muckraking done on both sides of the meatpacking debate. And what I liked about your book is I can tell from the brief amount that I visited with you, and then just what I found on your background is you're a Chicago guy, and like you're just like you're kind of like the Chicago historian. It seems like you've got a lot of work done on Chicago, and the way you took the Union Stockyards and just told the story of it and how it spawned the meatpacking industry, and or the meatpacking industry kind of spawned the Union Stockyard, and just you just told the story of the stockyards itself and the neighborhood surrounding it, and told it in a very compelling way. And it was kind of just straight down the middle factual. There wasn't a whole lot of opinion based writing in it. It seemed like but it was really well done. It was easy reading, and I enjoyed it a lot. So I'm really glad to have you on the show. I'm looking forward to reading your other books as well.
No, thank you. Yeah, when I was 20 years old, I went to work in the stockyards.
Mm-hmm.
I was a livestock handler, and so that was part of my original. And my mother worked in the meatpacking industry, and so did both of my grandfathers and my grandmothers for a short period of time. But lots of my aunts and uncles also worked in meatpacking. I grew up right by the Chicago Union Stockyard, and so it was always a part of my life in some ways, even when it was in decline. And even now, when it's gone, we still refer to the area as the Stockyards.
Yeah, and that's south side of Chicago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the Stockyard itself was between Pershing Road, it's 39th Street, and it went to 47th Street, and then from Halsted to Racine, so it was about a half a square mile, and then the half a square mile west of it was where the meatpacking house is located.
Okay, and so does that mean you're a Sox guy and not a Cubs guy?
You betcha.
All right, that makes me like you even more. I had a college roommate, good buddy of mine, from Barrington, and he was yeah. There you go. I'm a Rockies fan, so we're most of the time we're kind of in the same boat where we just kind of suck.
Yeah, I know.
But yeah, I had a college buddy that was a Sox fan, and boy, I mean not a Sox fan, a Cubs fan, and he was almost unbearable. And I really had no opinion on Chicago sports until I met him, and then I I got to where I hated everybody except the Sox coming out of Chicago as far as sports go.
Well,
So, but now I'm out of college. You know, I don't hear Chicago sports near as much. So I've faded back to where I kind of were. I was no opinion, but that's funny. You're a Sox fan, so I'll have to let him know that I talked to a real Chicago guy for once.
tell him we'll pray for him.
Okay. It feels like we ought to use a Jim Croce song to close out the episode, huh?
Sure.
I always like Jim Croce anyways, but so you're how many generations is your family in the US?
My grandparents came from Poland just
Okay.
before World War One, and
Okay.
so since about my grandfather about 1905, my grandmother about 1913, on both sides.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, is that kind of part of the Volga German migration as well, or is that
No,
I don't know the precise
no.
geography.
The Polish migration was all by itself. It was very large,
Mhm.
and it peaked just about the time my grandmother came. Um,
Okay.
and today, the Polish population of Chicago's diminishing. It's mostly moving to the suburbs and other places, but it still has a large Polish population.
Mm.
And
And
even in the neighborhood, there's still some Poles. Mostly today, the neighborhood that I grew up in is mostly his Latino and African American, but there's still some. My cousin still lives there, in fact.
oh, okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's Chicago has always kind of been what you'd kind of I guess for us out in the sticks, kind of a rough town. It seems like, you know, it's a lot of poor immigrants working in factories and packing houses, and it's always kind of had that kind of an edge to it. It seems like.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the outside image, but it's also a big cultural center and other kinds
Hmm.
of things like that. So, and gosh, it is probably the most capitalist city in the world in some ways. I mean,
Yeah, I think so.
if you think about the stockyard opening, it opened up on Christmas Day, 1865.
I
So,
that shocked me when I read that.
so what better way to celebrate Christ's birthday in the most capitalist city in the world than to open up a Union Stockyard?
Yeah. To open the thing that kind of drove and made Chicago what it was,
Yeah,
and the number one meat packing center in the world for dang near a century, you know.
right. Yeah,
And it's you know, coming from the producer side of the whole beef business, you know, very adversarial take towards the meat packing industry,
mhm,
but as just a fan of history, and you know, I think capitalism's great. It can be, you know, it can go dark at times. Meat packing industry is a shining example of that.
right.
Um, it can go off
Even
the
today,
rails,
yeah, even
but
today.
mhm, but all things considered, what was built in Chicago, like I guess it was already a main kind of vantage point for transport being on the waterways. But then the railroad really just ignited a, you know, a growth like not many cities have ever seen. And
Yeah, yeah, I was terrific. So the first railroad comes out of Chicago, 1848. That's the first one, and it chugs only out a few miles to actually what's today a suburb of Oak Park, and then it comes in reverse. But within 6 years, it's the center of the railroad industry. I mean, so if in some ways, if you think of it like today, all this computers and those kinds of industries are expanding. And what is it, Silicon Valley? Well,
mhm,
Chicago started as Silicon Valley of the 19th century, but it's railroads and then later becomes meatpacking and steel and things like that. So it really takes off. There's like 400 people living in Chicago about 1833. By 1893, there's a million. I mean, it's the
whew,
fastest growing city in the history up to that point,
yeah.
and it just takes off incredibly fast. Yeah.
It was in like just really incredible to read, as I've read through a lot of this stuff. And there was at the at one end where you get to say like the Upton Sinclair image where it was almost worse a worse place to be than where these poor immigrants came from.
Hmm.
And that probably was the case for a lot of them.
Hmm.
However, they built a um thriving Polish community. They built a thriving Irish community. Freed black slaves moved north to the factories. Built a huge black community, and like you said, is like a cultural center. And um, so at the same time, like on the far yay capitalism side, there's a lot of it's the shining example of the American dream where these poor immigrants can come in, or even the poor, like the skilled immigrant, initially. I mean, boy, they made good money. If they were skilled butchers, you could make a lot of money. And then as the technology increased, it allowed them to process more animals. And the huge cattle boom after post Civil War, where all the Texas cattle were had just been left to their own to their own ends for 4 years. And it was just like the perfect storm to show what capitalism can actually do.
Right.
And of course the truth lies somewhere in between, or it's exactly right for some groups of people and a whole lot of overlap between there.
Sure. Well, I mean, look, yeah, uh, I can look at a picture and interpret it one way. You can look at a picture and
Hmm.
interpret it another way. And the truth is that most Americans used to just come together and talk about things. We
Yeah,
often don't do that much now anymore. But
I agree, and I think the best way to do it, because you find out that you have a whole lot more in common than you
oh
think.
yeah, yeah,
And it's but when you look at what was able to be done with I mean, there was some really nasty shady practices that took place, and that always happens within any industry, no matter if it's a market economy or not. Just
sure.
there's always that happens. But they were able to provide high quality meat at a relatively cheap price,
Mhm.
particularly compared to what the previous
Well,
generations had to deal with.
if you look at it from a certain point of view, in the 1890s, it took a skilled butcher and his assistant to uh, uh, to slaughter a steer and cut it up into beeves and so forth and
Mhm.
distribute it, somewhere between 8 to 12 hours.
Yep.
At Armour and Company, it took 36 minutes.
Mhm.
So, and with hogs, it took about 6 to 8 hours. But at Armour and Company, it took 24 minutes,
Mhm.
and would be for sheep.
Yep.
So suddenly there was this production of meat. Now, for better or for worse, depending on how you feel about how much meat we should all eat every day,
Yeah,
there
exactly.
there is this
All of
tremendous,
it you want, I'd say.
absolutely. But it really changes the whole system. So a
Mhm.
lot of these people are coming into Chicago. They're coming out of rural areas. They know they've killed steers. They've killed. Grandma takes a chicken,
Mhm.
makes soup. Right? Everybody knew how to do this kind of stuff. But at Chicago, it was so mechanized, so industrialized that it became sort of like a slap in the face.
Yeah.
It became an awakening, an epiphany. So it became a big tourist uh, attraction. 500,000 people a year at the turn of the 19th to 20th century came to visit the stockyards and to see the slaughter. Even
Yeah.
as late as the early 1950s, uh, busloads of kids would come at the age of 9, 10 years old to see them slaughtering hogs. And believe me, that left a, a tremendous mark on their psyche.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah, I mean, most kids think that meat comes to the grocery market in plastic right from God. I mean,
Mhm.
we have no connection anymore. Most urban people have no connection with that anymore. Um,
Yeah.
while most did in the 19th century.
Yeah, and that's one of the biggest thing that drives a lot of this division that we see in our country is a lot of it has to deal with not so much just food, but just like the complete separation of how two different types of people live, and it comes from my side as well. You know, like we're like we a lot of people think the cities and they think just like bunch of screaming radical lefties, you know, all the time. But no, mostly it's a lot of working people that just
Sure,
work a different job, and
sure.
and there's so, but yeah, I think like that's also one of the kind of the drawbacks of this huge centralization of the packing industry is it gets a little, and especially now that everything's closed off. Like it's pretty tough to just get a tour of a packing plant anymore unless you are with some sort of group because of the liability behind it, you know,
Yeah.
from so many lawsuits and stuff. Whereas,
And and people demonstrate, right? I mean, because
mhm,
there's PETA and other groups like that are worried about animal rights, etc., justifiably. But
yeah,
I mean, there are some packing houses. Actually, I just read not long ago that have opened up to tours up in Minnesota, which is
I
kind
think
of
that's great.
yeah. I think people should know what's going on. And
Mhm.
the thing is, so I didn't. I work when I worked for this Union Stockyard company. I was outside. I was a livestock handler outside. I never saw a kill. We,
Yeah.
they didn't kill. We took animals off trucks, or trains, and we put them back on trucks and trains, and they went someplace else to be killed.
Mm,
So I never saw a slaughter till I was writing my book, Slaughterhouse. And I called up a friend whose family owned one of the last meatpacking houses in Chicago. And
mhm.
he said, "You want to see it? Come on down and see it." So I was, a little leery, because I had never seen this before. Um, but I went, and it was a sheep slaughterhouse. And from the moment the sheep were shackled as they came in and went up in the air, you
Yeah.
cut their throat. It happened so fast that after about 2 minutes, you just realize it's a job.
Yep.
It's just a job.
Yep.
And so I followed the sheep all the way through to the cooler. Um, I must tell you, when I came home, my dog was happy to see me because
Oh, I bet so.
I had been standing in blood for a half hour, 40 minutes.
Oh,
But
yeah.
outside of that, it just turned up being a job. Now, my mother worked in the canning department. My grandfather worked on the slaughterhouse floors. Um, they worked all over the area, and at the time, when I run a little place called the Packingtown Museum, and
Mm.
it's in an old packing house in the stockyards. It's still there. They don't. It's no longer a packing house. It's a food industry incubator. Small businesses. But we have the little museum in there, and whenever people past a certain age, a little bit older people come in, the one thing they remember is the smell,
Mhm.
because there's this kind of overpowering stench that came out of the meatpacking industry. Not necessarily out of the stockyard, but out of the meatpacking
And
industry.
yeah.
You know,
Yeah, with all the blood and the offal and
yeah,
it
and
just it's
turning fertilizer plants were there too.
mhm.
All that kind of stuff. So that's the one thing they mostly remember. And my memory of it was, of course, very different because I was on, in the pens working with the animals.
Yeah. So that was that all done on foot?
Yeah,
Oh.
some guys had horses. I I'm a city boy. I'm not good on a horse. Several times in the stockyards, I think horses tried to kill me. But
That's funny.
so basically, the first night I worked there, they put me in a hog house, and that was an interesting experience. And then later they moved me to the cattle alleys, and
Okay.
but at one point we unloaded the most livestock I ever saw. The runs at Chicago used to run into tens of thousands.
Oh, I bet.
One time 120,000 hogs in one day.
Oof.
Uh, and so I think the top run on cattle was almost 40,000 in one night. They would come in.
Oh, that's a lot of cows.
That's a lot of cattle. Yeah, and so
I think the most I've ever seen in a night, I used to work at a huge feedlot in
mhm,
western Kansas. It was about 120,000 head capacity, but we'd get the big runs of cattle coming off the Flint Hills of Kansas, and
mhm.
um, I think I unloaded 42 trucks by myself one Sunday,
Wow.
but
Right.
so that for one place
That's a
You know,
lot.
that's a lot, but then, yeah, I mean, that's like a fraction of what the stockyards were doing every single
Right.
day, and it was, it's an incredible, like, a lot of trial and error, a lot of butting heads, and a lot of,
Sure.
threatening to take my ball and go home, by, the packing industry,
Yeah.
and eventually they kinda did finally pull the football out from under Chicago, and, it's, and so, like, it all happened in the course of, what was it, 106 years from open to start?
Yep. Yeah, about 106 years. Now, after we closed, there were still some packing houses. They bought
Yeah.
directly from farmers, producers.
Mhm.
But most of them are gone. There's only one left, I believe.
Hmm.
That's a hog slaughterhouse, still in the stock.
Really?
Yeah, yeah.
That's
Everybody else is gone.
that's crazy. Now, and you said your granddad used to work in the building where your museum.
Yeah, he ended his career. My mother's father ended his career in the building where my museum is, and in fact, he got hurt there, and
Oh, okay.
he died shortly after. So yeah,
Huh.
so his picture's on the wall now. That's kind of revenge.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's amazing though. It makes sense why you're such a Chicago guy. I mean, you got some really deep roots there at this point.
Yeah, I've been here. It seems like, yeah, our family's been here. Well, over 100 years, but which is actually kind of long for Chicago because people come and go constantly.
Yeah.
But we were in that neighborhood for 3 generations. In fact, I'm in that neighborhood still periodically because I only live about 5 miles away, but I'm work there at the museum.
Yeah. That's amazing. And so when the stockyards closed down, and then you said you stayed on for a little bit afterwards while they
Mhm.
were doing some demolition and stuff. And then,
Mhm.
um, were you in? I guess you would have been in college probably when this was
Right.
all.
Yeah.
So, because I was listening to another podcast that you had done, um, and you were talking about how you had a education deferment for the Vietnam War, and
Mhm.
that was that had to have been some really contentious times there in Chicago at that point in time.
Yeah, and of course, the stockyard was located right behind the International Amphitheater, where the Democratic Convention had been in
Oh
1960.
yeah.
You know, um, and it was kind of contentious. There was, we people were on edge about civil rights, about the war, about
Hmm.
all kinds of things. And growing up at that time period was. It was an education in itself, and I went to the University of Illinois at Chicago, which wasn't a very radical campus, but it got closed down during the Cambodian invasion. Uh,
Mm.
and at that point, I was working nights in the stockyards. So I originally worked the shift from like 5:30 till 1:30 in the morning. But then I left for a while, and then I came back, and then I worked a 2 to 10 shift, which made it possible for me to go to school.
Yeah.
And the stockyard was only a short bus ride from the university, so it wasn't hard at all.
Now, did they have a lot of turnover in employment there?
Oh yeah,
Yeah, I would imagine so.
yeah,
It seems
especially
to
in
me like that'd be a lot like a dairy, like a modern day dairy farm or a feedlot or something where just like continual employee turnover.
yeah, because I mean, the pay was not stellar, right? It
Yeah.
was minimal, and also the people who worked in the packing houses that changed. At one time in the 1920s, Armor and Company they employed 8,000 people in Chicago at their plant. And they actually had to hire 8,000 people that year. Now, that didn't mean everybody left,
Yeah.
but some jobs, the guy would come in 2 days and say, "I'm out of here. This is
Mhm.
crazy." Because where you were introduced largely as if you're new, and these are all unskilled. They're not skilled butchers, right? So they're coming
Yeah.
in, and the first job you get is a squeegee man. Squeegee man just stands 10 to 12 hours a day pushing blood into a gutter.
Mhm.
And and guys doing this for 10 to 12 hours, he might go home and say, I'm not going back.
Oh
Or,
yeah.
or they would shackle the guys had to shackle the hind legs of animals.
Mm.
Hogs are smart. They try to bite. They try to get you. They know what's going on.
Yeah.
Cattle are not quite that way. But and by the way, cattle are knocked out before they're shackled. So
Yeah.
it was, but those were tough jobs, and all the jobs were pretty hard. Um, at the time, and the conditions that they worked under were not always great. I mean, so yeah, there was a lot of turnover in the meatpacking industry, and there still is. I mean, even today we're
Mhm.
talking about kids working in meatpacking that there's been an issue about.
Yeah, that's been popping up a lot here
Yeah.
lately.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I did an internship for Beef Products International when I was in my senior year of college, and they were the company out of Sioux Falls that made the pink slime, the lean, finely textured beef,
Hmm.
and it was a shock for me. The biggest thing is you had 45 minutes of sunshine every day. You had a 15-minute break and a 30-minute lunch, and that was everything else was inside, and it was cold and wet, and it just all of it just kind of it's not a fun job really. I mean, I guess there are probably some people that liked it, and I was nowhere near the kill floor or anything, but it just
Yeah.
it's so mechanized and automated, and yeah, it's wild. It's
Yeah. See, I like working there, but I worked outside,
Mhm.
and that was different. I
Yeah,
worked with the animals outside. We unloaded trucks and trains and loaded trucks and trains, and that was
yeah.
about it. So that was very different than what my grandparents did or my mother.
Mm. Yeah, and so what did your grandfather, what did he start out as?
He was an unskilled worker. He became after a while a meat inspector, and then after he hit his 50s, they laid him off, and he went back to working as a maintenance man.
Huh.
Uh, but so remember at the time, um, there weren't a lot of uh, protection for workers, and so you were sort of at the whim of who you worked for. Um, yeah, so they. But they were always fortunate. They always during the my other grandfather was actually a steam fitter at Armor, so he had a skill. Uh,
Mhm.
but uh, they were all, both sides of the family were lucky in that during the Depression they were never laid off because
Oh, okay.
they kept slaughtering, and they worked in on the floors.
Yeah. I that's kind of one thing about working in in agriculture is it's not necessarily recession proof, but it's pretty close to it. Like there's
Hmm.
always a job in agriculture, in particular if you've got some sort of skilled job, but it's
Sure.
and yeah, it's I guess what is your kind of like overall view of how the stockyards rose up and the packing industry with it, and how it like kind of you know got to like the apex of what American capitalism is, and then kind of the I guess
Well,
it was a gradual at first, and then eventually it just like it was gone, huh?
yeah. Well, what happened actually was so in 1921, 22, there are eight. In those 2 years, the Union Stockyard receives over 18 million head of livestock each year.
Mhm.
That's a lot of livestock.
Lot of livestock.
And it's also the largest horse market in the country as well. Now, these are not horses to slaughter, of course. These are working horses,
Yeah.
or race horses. Um, so there's a lot of activity. That's sort of the peak. World War One is sort of the peak, and is in the immediate aftermath. Let's say 1920 to 22 or so. And then you start seeing it go down. Now, why do you see it going down? Because they're changing. The meatpacking houses there are looking for a different way to buy animals. Okay. So on the livestock market, they would find 200 buyers in a day. It's sort of like
Mhm.
they would go from pen to pen and bid. And if you were the commission man, let's say you had sent 100 cattle in, and I was your commission man, well, I had something in my mind about what I wanted to sell them for, what I could for that day.
Mhm.
And some guy came in and said, "No, I'll give you so and so much, which is too little, I'd say no. And the
Yep.
next guy would come in and they would bid and bid and bid until I sold them, or I'd hold them over for the next day.
Mhm.
And when I thought I could, so sort of like Wall Street, it was the Wall Street of livestock in many ways.
Yeah.
But what happens in the 20s now is, and even a little bit before, our meatpacking houses are now going down to farmers, going down to producers, and they're saying, look, here's the deal. You send your cattle to Chicago, they get 10% because they get a commission. They charge you for pen, they charge you for feed, they charge you for water, they charge you for everything. But I'm your buddy. I'm the meat packer. I'm your buddy. I'm going to buy it for you. I'll pay you what you'd get at Chicago, and you don't have all that hassle. You don't have to pay for anything. So you're a producer. You say, "Wow, that saves me 10% or so, somewhere between 10 and 15% maybe." And I
Mhm.
don't, often these guys would go with their livestock into Chicago, so that's costly too. That was a night out on the town, and there were plenty of
Yep.
places to entertain around the stockyards. But there were a lot actually. But it was a hassle. And they say, okay, so you'll just send a truck down here and pick up the livestock, right? Don't worry about it. And they would do that. Well, they did that until they finally wore the stockyard down and it closed. And then you didn't have a market the
Mhm.
same. And and really, I think my personal feeling is that the loss of central markets, not just Chicago, but Omaha, Kansas City, East St. Louis, South St. Paul,
Mhm.
meant the end of family farms in the Midwest to a large extent because they could just, so Smithfield runs its own industrial farms. You
Yep.
know, they kill 150,000 hogs a day. They have their own industrial farms. A lot of these big packers have their own industrial farms. They don't go to Farmer Jones and say, "Do you have 25 cattle I can purchase?" They simply say, "You're out of business,
Mhm.
and we'll
W
take your land and we'll turn it into an industrial farm." So we have a problem here in Illinois with these huge industrial hog farms. I mean, you've got just incredible stench
Yep.
because they have tens of thousands of hogs under roofs, um, and and they've replaced hundreds of little farms
Yep.
that once were sort of the backbone of Illinois and backbone of the country, frankly.
Yeah.
And I think family farms really hurt by this. But if I was a farmer in 1950 and somebody came to me, you don't have to send it to the Chicago Stockyards. I'll send a truck to pick it up, and you'll make the same. I'd probably say, sure, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
You don't think about the future. You don't think about the unintended consequences. Not that the
Well, and
stock, not that the stockyards were saints and they that people didn't get screwed anyway. But
yeah.
but still, there was something there that
Well,
protected.
and it helped lead to the kind of the decline in the understanding between urban and rural as well,
Hmm. Hmm.
because, that like you said, those nights on the town, you might get in a fight. You also might make a really good buddy,
Hmm.
and, all of a sudden, you got people from Chicago going out to see their buddy in the country,
And
and that a lot of that's gone now.
and you remember from 1900 on till 1975, there was the International Livestock Exposition was in Chicago.
Mhm.
It would draw hundreds of thousands of people, city folk primarily.
Mhm.
Um, it even made local television. They would have local television programs about it. It was a
Yeah.
big thing. Um, and people got to interact with other people, as you say, a little bit more. I mean, part of the problem is, even look, I'm a geezer. I'm an old guy now, right? I sit back and I think, people date online, people talk online. They don't meet for a beer on the corner anymore, right? Uh,
Yeah.
so we've become atomized to an extent. And I think that my book is called "How the Chicago Stockyards and the World It Made." And I still think that the industry is sort of symbolic of how the world has moved on.
I don't think you're wrong on that at all. I think, it's always, harken back to the good old days, but there is something just missing because like the I was talking with a fella from New York as a horse trainer, and he talks about all these like these black cowboy clubs throughout urban areas where, so and so's great grandfather came from the South to, New York or wherever, to LA to get a job. And
Mhm.
and he was a cowboy back then, but he went to go work at a factory, but he kept that tradition alive. And
Mhm.
And it's kind of the same. I mean, you have all these immigrant communities throughout the cities, and then when all that gets intermingled with like a place like the stockyards, and you get all these ranchers and farmers coming from the country, like there's something really beautiful about that, and it
Mhm.
and it uh it was part of the it was one of the big reasons that kind of helped intermingle like the west and the east. Was like Chicago was the terminus for all that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's true. And remember the railroads connected both coasts in
Mhm.
1869. So that meant, and Chicago was in the middle of it.
Mhm.
So if you wanted to go from New York to Sacramento, California, you had to stop in Chicago because that was the terminal. It
Mhm.
stopped, and you had to get off the train. You had to spend the night, right? Probably at the Palmer House or someplace like that, and then get on another train in the morning and head out towards California. So we always I always say we always got our 10% one way or the
Yeah.
other. And but it's true. It just became sort of the nexus where people just sort of met each other and spread around throughout the country. And one of the fascinating things about places like Chicago and New York and other big cities is this intermingling of people. But in Chicago, I think the sort of rural urban mix was very important because this was, and in some ways still is, a major food producer. I mean,
Mhm.
we have we have various packing houses here. They don't slaughter. They're not slaughterhouses, but they're packing houses. They buy
Mhm.
beeves from Iowa or Wyoming or wherever, and they're brought in on trucks, and then they cut them up here and they distribute them. Um, and in the stockyard today, it's now called the Chicago Stockyard Industrial Park, and it is the most successful industrial park in the city. There's 15,000 people working in the stockyards today. Um, Not all of them in the meat industry or even in the food industry, but they're there. And they're, for instance, one of the big companies that produces, I forget its name now, produces meat for McDonald's, right, is in the
Mhm.
stockyards. There's various others, and there's now a couple of businesses that um, this is totally against what we're talking about here, but they grow meat in jars and stuff for petri dishes. They're located there. And so there's still a tremendous amount of industry in the area, but that old intermingling between urban and rural has disappeared basically.
Yeah. That it's kind of crazy how it all what are your thoughts on that lab grown meat stuff? What do you think about that?
I've tasted it. It's okay. It's not beef.
Yeah.
I like beef and I like
Yeah.
pork and I like lamb and um,
Yeah.
I guess I'm a carnivore.
I'm the same way.
Yeah,
I raise beef, and I think the perfect cut of meat that God put on
yeah,
this earth is a beef ribeye.
sure.
I don't think there's anything. I mean, I've got a brisket on the smoker right now, but I love lamb. I love good pork. I mean,
Sure.
and I don't know, like I don't know. Maybe that's the quest of humans. They're always trying to kind of play God, and I think you can try to make meat, but, like,
Yeah, but you
meat comes from an animal, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's probably true. I mean, look, there's room for it all, I guess. You know,
Yeah.
but you know, these are companies are producing these products now, and I have to tell you, I ate chicken that tasted like chicken, but wasn't chicken. It did taste like chicken, but it wasn't
Yeah.
chicken. You know,
Yeah.
you can do a lot of things. And in fact, in the building that my little museum is in. And by the way, it was voted the best tiny museum to learn Chicago history in the city.
That's
S-
all. I can't wait to go see that.
well, when you come up here, you let me know. I'll meet you and I'll show you around and I'll show you around the neighborhood.
I'm gonna hold you to that, 'cause that I've never the only time I've spent in Chicago was 12 hours at O'Hare in a
Mm.
during a blizzard, you know?
Yeah,
And, so I didn't have a great experience there, but it wasn't bad. I mean, when I finally got a connecting flight, I just went to the bar and we took bets on whether our plane was going to be delayed or not.
Yeah.
And um,
You
but
know,
it's yeah. So I now that you put that on the table, I'm gonna take you up on it. I've always wanted to go. We'll go
yeah,
see a Sox game.
sure, absolutely. You know, when the stockyard closed, um, I traveled around the Midwest. I went to Omaha, Cedar.
Hmm.
It was still operating as a stockyard, but it was in very quickly going to close. Visited a couple of stockyards in Iowa, Sioux Falls, and ended up in Yankton, South Dakota, visiting there too. And because my father had an army reunion up there, so we
Oh,
drove.
okay.
And Yankton actually had two small stockyards, so I went to both of them. It was interesting, and you realize how big an industry it really was, and is. But it's always been dominated by three or four big meat
Hmm.
packers, and it still is today. You
Yep.
know, they're not names that everybody knows, like Armour, Swift, Wilson. Those are names that are sort of embedded in our, especially in Chicago, in the back of our minds, because their families are still here and still have a lot of money. But so you got like Iowa beef and so forth, and the place you mentioned earlier. Um,
Yeah.
and some of them are just S&G or something like that.
Yeah. It's JBS is that
Maybe,
was who they bought Swift, and then
yeah,
Tyson bought IBP Iowa Beef, and then what's the it's Cargill and Marfrig. Marfrig is National Beef Packing, but yeah, JBS and Marfrig are Brazilian owned, and
and
they're
Smithfield is owned by the Chinese.
yeah, it's it is and I'm a very patriotic American. I come from immigrants. I'm half Mexican. But I'm like old school, like generations. My last census record I could find was 1870 in Herefino, Colorado. So it was my ancestors probably from the old conquistadors and settled
Mhm.
in what was old Spain or Mexico back then,
Mhm.
generations. But I work with almost exclusively Mexican guys, all immigrants, and
Mhm.
um and that's part of like lower class people that the you know immigrants and lower class native folk born people, like you get to know each other when you work in these kind of what
Mhm.
other people kind of see as shitty jobs, and
Mhm.
you build a camaraderie with people like that.
If you took the stockyard and you put it in the middle of a circle
Hmm.
in 1925, and that circle had a diameter of about 3 miles, you could count 35 Catholic churches in orbit around the stockyards.
Really?
Every wave of immigrant that came in had their own parish and so forth. Now, if you add on to that the Protestant churches and several synagogues, you could really see the mix of people in that community. I mean,
Hmm.
it was just amazing. I mean, when I was growing up as a boy, I could swear in 5 different languages.
Really?
Yeah,
That's awesome. That's awesome.
yeah, Spanish, Polish, Lithuanian, German,
That's
and
crazy.
eventually Yiddish too. So because it was just so many people, and yet you worked with, and they would say something. I said, "What does that mean?" And then they'd tell me,
Yeah.
and I'd say it too. And before you know it, we were all swearing at each other in
Yeah.
various
Yeah.
language.
And it's as where a lot of the like the off color humor that that made comedy so great came from just straight out of just like working guys talking
Sure,
shit to each other, and nowadays it's considered racist. A lot of it was back in the day, but I don't know. There's just there was something about just that the act of just talking shit to each other is just something that guys do,
yeah,
and it built I don't know, it builds thick skin, and it builds good character, and you make good friends when you can
yeah.
talk shit to each other in different languages.
Well, I certainly enjoyed. So I not only worked in the stockyard, but I worked in various factories. So one thing about growing up in the '60s in Chicago was every summer in any factory anywhere. and I was in a very industrial part of town, people go off on vacation.
Mm-hmm.
So there were jobs. So I could get a job and I could work either on a line making something or work in a stockyard or whatever. I worked in a steel mill. But I always had a job, you know. Um, and when I was teaching, I retired from teaching about 5, 6 years ago. I would ask my students what kind of jobs do they have? Where did they work? None of them even knew what an assembly line was.
Mm.
None of them had seen it. None of them had that kind of experience because that had all passed away to a large
Huh.
extent. I mean, the steel mill I worked in is about to become an Amazon distribution center. Um,
Jeez.
and there were 50,000 steel jobs in the city at one point. They're all gone, just about all. Just about all the meatpacking jobs, or well, at least the slaughterhouse jobs, are all gone. This was once the candy manufacturing center of the world. There's just a handful of candy producers now.
Huh.
The one thing that's coming back is breweries. There's a lot of breweries.
That's the one thing I don't know if will ever change is Americans do like to drink because they're from cultures of all around the world and they all like to drink. And
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
it's yeah, it's pretty crazy. So you went you finished school, you got your PhD. Did you go right into teaching after?
I was lucky. I did even when I before I graduated with my doctorate. I was teaching part time in various places. My first teaching job was actually teaching GED classes, general education classes, kids who dropped out of high school, to actually
Mhm.
to gang kids in Chicago. Um, and I was lucky then. Just before I got my PhD, I got this job at Columbia College in Chicago, and I stayed there for 38 years, something like that. And so, yeah, I was among the lucky because a lot of the teaching jobs at the university level are gone now.
Yeah.
That's an
So
industry that's changing. Yeah.
what were the main kind of uh concentrations that you were teaching as a professor?
I did history of American City, history of Chicago, history of American working class. I did for 22 years. Me and a buddy of mine co-taught a class on the Vietnam War,
Mm,
and I taught classes on the 1960s, and then some general U.S. history courses as well.
okay. Um I gotta ask, during the Vietnam War, did you what was that like being like a guy on deferral or deferment? Like how was the because I kind of feel like we're almost at that point right now with this Ukraine situation where if something really like we really get involved in a major way, there's I don't see us fighting against Russia without some sort of mobilization and draft.
Yeah. Well, the draft was just a reality of life from 1940 basically until 1973 or something like that.
Mhm.
There had always been this sort of draft. So I grew up, and every when I was in college, many of my friends were already in the army or in Vietnam because I grew up in a working class community, and those are the guys who went
Yep.
um, for the most part. And in fact, oh, two of my best friends were there. Three of them were there at the time, and one of them lives about 90 feet away from me now, and he was best man at my wedding. I was best man at his wedding, but he had stepped on a booby trap, and I was working in the stockyards, and his father called me. I was in the stone gate. The stone gate was this ornamental gate that you entered into the stockyards through, and
Mhm.
we had our offices there for security guards.
Yeah.
And they called me and says, "Hey, there's a telephone call for you." So I went and talked to him, and he said that my buddy was coming home, and I said, "Well, he's not due to come home for another 8 months." He says, "Well, stepped on a booby trap," and so that was the beginning of him coming home. But at least he was alive, and he did well over time. He became a Chicago policeman, so he's okay. But both of his ankles were messed up for a while. But a lot of the guys that I knew had gone to Vietnam, and it was, I thought about it. I thought about upping, myself at one point or another. But by the time, by 1969, 1970, it just seemed like it was a desperate situation. It would be very difficult to reinstate a draft.
I think it would be too, but I
Parents
think,
all over the country would start screaming and voting against it.
and that would be, that'd be good too. But I'm very much. I think we should back away from that deal as much as we can. But I think when you look at throughout history and the size of the Russian army, I don't see how, if we were to get actually involved without some sort of mobilization.
Yeah, I think. Well, I think if there's something that big, but I don't think it'll ever get
I
there.
hope not.
In
I hope
Vietnam,
not.
at its peak, there were 500,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam.
Mm,
That's a lot of troops,
a
uh,
lot. It's a
but
lot.
it's not compared to World War II,
No.
or World War One. So, you know, um, well, we'll just have to see what happens.
Yeah. I hope that's not the case. I hope
Me too.
something comes up. There's some sort of negotiation um before it ever comes to that. But anyway, I'm just curious as how, cuz like you said, being a working class community, that's who went over there. My biological dad did 2 or 3 tours over there, and
Mm.
it was it was it was a interesting time in this country's history. And
Yeah, and a very divisive time.
yeah.
As you
Yeah.
know, in some ways, we're going through that too here,
Yep.
domestically right now.
Yeah, I think so too. And I guess I just, as much stuff that I read on history. I mean, reading your book and others like it, it seems like there's just waves throughout the US history. Just like there's this people are at each other's throats and then they kind of get along. And then they're at each other's throats and then they kind of get along.
Sure.
And when everybody's getting along, man, we do really, really good shit.
Well, we do, and when we don't get along, we do really bad shit.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And yeah, so
I mean, there was this little thing called the Civil War,
mhm.
which was the most disastrous war in our history, really.
Yeah. Yeah, it really was. I mean, it was awful, it's like all around awful. Was it fought for the right reasons? Probably yes. But it's not nearly as simple as a simple, slavery and non-slavery issue. It was
There
was a
were
lot.
other issues as well. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And it was just, yeah, it was awful. And I hope to never see anything even close to that ever again. And
Okay.
so you always look at that and you're like, yeah, it could be worse.
Hmm.
And yeah, so but I think having conversations is that helps just about more than anything, is getting people talking to each other, not
Yeah,
talking at each other.
I think that's really important, and I think often we just talk at each other these days,
Mhm.
and it's important to listen to what the other guy's got to say. And you
Yep.
can disagree, but you might also agree with 90% of what he's saying.
Right.
You know,
Right. Or it might say something where that you've never thought of it in that way
exactly,
before.
exactly.
And it's yeah, it's I think it's important. Going back to, so you started teaching, and how how long were you a professor before you started writing books?
Oh, I actually wrote my first book before I had my doctorate.
Oh,
Uh,
really?
yeah, and so it's always been a part of my life. I just finished a book, a manuscript that I'm handing in tomorrow.
Oh,
So
okay.
so I'm happy about that. It'll be, if it's published, and I'm sure it will be. I've got a contract. Um, uh, it will be my ninth book, and
Okay.
I've got, probably 20, 25 articles, book reviews, things like that. I've been pretty active. I like what I'm doing, and so I retired from the classroom six years ago. It'll be 6 years, May 30th. Um, And but I keep lecturing. I work on music. I've got a new exhibit opening up at the Chicago History Museum on May 20th that I worked on Polish Chicago. Um, I've got various projects, and and my latest project is I just became a grandfather. So
Oh, well, congratulations.
thank you. Yeah, little
That's
boy.
great.
Yeah, our first,
That's
and
great.
yeah, he's a cute kid. Unfortunately, he lives in Massachusetts, so he's a bit of
Oh,
we go back and forth. They come here, so it's been a fulfilling life. I enjoy it. It's just that I mean I think education has changed. Higher education, especially, has changed quite a bit in the last 10 years or so. Um, I knew it was time for me to get out of the classroom when they no longer understood my jokes, because
um,
my jokes were all about Jimmy Stewart and John Wayne, and they had no idea who they were, and I had no idea who the hell they were talking about.
yeah. See, I graduated college in 2009, and it's a completely different world. I haven't been back to I went to Colorado State University, and
Mhm.
I haven't been back in several years, and it's yeah, it's a whole different world from when I went there, and I don't recognize it much.
Yeah, and it's become uh, the funding. So when I was an undergraduate student at U of I, 77, maybe 80% of the budget was covered by either the state or the federal government.
Mhm.
Today it's 17%. So that means tuition goes up.
Yep.
I mean, somebody's got to pay for it, and university professors and staff, and everybody wants a computer, and
Mhm.
you want, I can't believe these dorms that have big screen television sets in the bedrooms and
Oh.
workout rooms and all this other kind of stuff. Which to me, a dorm was you lived like a monk, right? There was
Mm.
these two guys in a room, and of course, I lived at home. I didn't have to live in a dorm, but um, I was at a commuter college, but um, so things have changed, and the funding has not followed. So it makes it difficult, and so you raise tuition, and kids take these debts on these. I mean, the crushing debts. I mean, I when I was going to U of I paid probably for a year, and tuition $400.
Really?
I could make $400 in the stockyards over the summer,
Oh,
easily,
yeah.
and I could still have money for books, and by the way, beer. So
Yeah.
there was but now you got these kids graduating, and $80,000 worth of debt, $100,000 worth of debt. They can't buy a house. They can't. They're caught,
Yeah.
and I think partially I'll tell you personally, I feel that that's the problem of my generation.
Mm.
You're younger than me, so not your generation, but my generation. We just dropped the ball. We didn't fund colleges the way they were funded. We stepped back. We
Yeah.
became greedy. I don't want to pay those taxes. I don't need to pay those taxes. You know,
Yeah.
and I think that that's caused a problem across the board for the country as a whole. Um, because look, not every kid should go to college. Absolutely not. Some
No.
I had a kid come into my class. I'll never forget this. He came into my office, and he closed the door and he started crying. Young man, about 20, 21. I says, "What's wrong?" He says, "I don't want to be here." He was not doing well in my class, obviously.
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, don't be here then." I mean, you're 21. You can do what you want. He says, "No, my mother wants me to be here." I says, "Well, your mother wants you to be here?" I mean, he wanted to be a mechanic. He was good with cars. So go be good with cars.
Yeah.
I was not going to call his mother up and tell him that, but I says, "You're 21. Do what you want to do." When I was 21, I did what I wanted to do. You
Yeah.
know, and at 18, you can do what you want to do. Um, Not everybody. I'm sure the parent who did this felt she was doing it for his
Mhm.
best of intentions, but he was so unhappy,
Yeah.
and he was at an art school. He wasn't even nothing he wanted to do. He wanted to work on cars. So go work on cars. He's going to make a lot more money
Oh,
over
yeah.
you know. Um, so I think not everybody needs to go to college, but I think those that do should not be crucified for going by getting saddled with $100,000 worth of debt to
Yeah.
4 years of college.
No, I think you're right. There's I mean, I think there's an understandable backlash of people that didn't go to college. Like, hey, why am I having to pay that? And I understand that.
Right.
But also, yeah, like the predatory system of the whole student loan stuff
It's
is
terrible.
off.
Yeah.
I've experienced, I'm experiencing that myself, and I didn't, I didn't get the huge massive
Mhm.
debt that a lot of, but it was not nothing. I mean, it was still fairly sizable, and it's yeah, I don't know. It's
And the thing is, the jobs that were around
mhm.
that could have paid for some of this stuff are gone. They just disappeared in places like
Yep.
Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit.
Yeah.
And so you can't. These poor kids are caught between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
So
I
something's got to be done.
I think I've been reading a lot more into the labor movement stuff, from back in the coal miner,
Mhm.
and then there's Chicago and stuff. And I grew up not a union guy, but we didn't have union jobs around. I mean, like other than the teachers union, but these are small schools. This is not like the city where they go on, this teachers unions go on strike quite a bit. And the union stuff is just kind of foreign to me.
Mhm.
And because it just wasn't around much. And so I guess I have the kind of the benefit of looking at it from kind of a 30,000-foot view. and
Mhm.
and you look and I think, boy, they really did a good job of establishing rights for the workers, and kind of keeping these giant corporations at bay. But then at the same time, they drove up the price of labor, and eventually shifted stuff out of to non-union friendly states or
Well,
overseas.
and that's exactly what happened with meatpacking. So what happened with so when Wilson and Company closed in, I think, what was it, 1954, 55. Wilson was this big, huge meat packer in Chicago, and
Mhm.
its plant covered maybe 20, 30 acres. And they closed up, and they said basically, you got in 5 weeks we're gone,
Yeah.
and they laid all these guys off, men and women at the time.
Mhm.
Um, and where did they move? They moved to Oklahoma, which is a right to work state, and they
Yep.
killed the union. And so a lot of these meatpacking houses, that's exactly what they did. They broke the unions by moving out of places like Chicago and St. Louis and Omaha, Kansas City, and so okay, so for them it was better at the bottom line, right? They didn't have to pay union wages, they didn't have to pay union benefits. But for the guys they left behind, I mean, one of the reasons I think, and I could be wrong. My wife proves to me that I'm wrong just about all the time. Um, but a lot of the slum conditions in Chicago are because these industries have moved out,
Yeah.
and they left behind guys with mortgages and you know kids and paying for schools, and send a lot of kids to Catholic schools here too.
Mhm.
Which used to be almost free, but now are not. Um, and they just sort of you know kissed him and said goodbye, and that was
Yep.
it. And abandoned the neighborhoods, and so you see a lot of the collapse of these inner cities because there's no industry, because there's no place to go. Now,
Mhm.
Chicago's lucky because it's still the second or third largest industrial center in the country,
Mhm.
and it's because of the railroads. It's the one of the largest container ports in the country. All the stuff
Mhm.
from L.A. and from New Jersey come to Chicago, and we redistribute it. So
Mm.
there's plenty. There's still work here, but the kinds of jobs that I was able to get as a kid, they're just not there. They're just not there. And so you see unemployment, especially among let's say Latino and African American populations now that had a chance to give a good job in a packing house, decent paying job, benefits, they're now sweeping floors in empty warehouses, or they're not
Mm.
working at all. And then that's a problem because now they're paid minimum wage, where before they had some chance to buy a house, maybe get a car, and so forth. So it's something that we all got to think about, how, and it's going to be more of a problem when all these robots do everything, right?
Yeah. That
You know,
that's gonna
yeah, I can see a real problem with that. I mean, now they're
yeah,
talking about trucks that can be driven by computers, right?
yeah.
They start doing that. Well, of course, I'll tell you what, a cattle truck will never be unloaded by a computer.
No.
but
I, they tried one of those little robot, uh, things in one of the feedlots to I think it was Cargill that had it maybe. And it was like, a little tracked it was like kinda like an R2-D2 looking
Mhm.
thing, and it had, two flags that would wave back and forth, and then you see a video of it later on its side turn a circle after some steer just blew it right over.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's like, yeah, I don't think they're gonna get robots,
Mhm.
working cattle. There's
Not for a long time. Yeah.
not for and if once they get a robot that can move like a human and move cattle like a human, then, we're in a world of hurt
Right.
more than anything.
Yeah, it's very different. Yeah, yeah.
It's, no, it's pretty incredible to see how in the relatively short amount of time when we're talking when did I guess the packing industry really started at around like 1860 or something in Chicago?
Well, so the big meat packing center was Cincinnati before Chicago.
Torcopolis.
Yeah, and it moved sort of west and settled in Chicago and other places. So yeah, there's meat packing in Chicago from 1820 on, but where
Mm.
it really begins to settle in is the late 1850s, early 1860s. Yeah.
And then 1865, the stockyards was open, and
Mhm.
then everything that just centralized everything in it.
Yeah, and so there had been probably a half a dozen small stockyards in Chicago.
Mm,
So when a packing house needed, let's say they had to slaughter 1,000 cattle, they might have to go to 3, 4 places to get the cattle because these were small stockyards. So the Pork Packers Association and the 9 railroads came together. These were all, and by the way, they were all friends of Abraham Lincoln who ran these things.
mhm.
They all came together and they formed the Union Stockyard, which had sort of two meanings, right? Union because the Civil War had just ended, and but
Yep,
it also was the uniting of all these stockyards,
yep.
and so that became an important symbolic part of it. But yeah, once they came together, then many of the packing houses, which had been a few miles away along the Chicago River, began to move next to the stockyard because it was just easier. You didn't have to drive cattle. You drive cattle on the hoof, they lose weight, they get hurt, they break a leg.
Yeah.
You and if you drive them in the middle of a city, they get hit by a streetcar, you know? So it became easier just to have them next to the stockyard. And then they built these ramps, which went over all the pens and over the railroad yards. So, and some of those ramps were 3 stories high, so you could have animals coming and going back and forth,
Huh.
and they drove them over to the stockyards, and then they would kill the animals on the top floor of the peat packing houses, and then
Oh, okay.
and everything was taken by gravity down because there was not electrification at the time.
Yeah, and these were like 9-story packing
Yeah.
houses,
Oh
weren't
yeah,
they?
I used to, when some of the packing houses were still, they were there, they were sort of broken open, and you would roam into them, would crawl up to the top, and you could see the kill floors on the top floor, you know,
Hmm.
and the drains for the blood and everything. And so the animal basically made its way down to the hide rooms and the coolers.
Huh. That's wild.
Very mechanized, and you pass an army of almost 200 men and women before the animal hit the freezer room, or the cooler room.
Yeah. And it was I don't remember. I mean, the old story, that, Henry Ford got his idea for the assembly line from the disassembly line
Right.
watching the packing house work,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and, yeah, it was, like, incredible innovation, and it was all it was all market driven too. It
Right.
was that was the crazy thing is it was the people
Well,
in the East wanted meat and
well, that's an interesting story because the railroads,
yeah.
they liked bringing live cattle
Mhm.
because you charge more
Yep.
because it's their blood, the horns, it's all by weight. And when the stockyards started creating these refrigerated cars, they didn't want to carry them. So the Grand Trunk Railroad from Canada said, "Well, we'll carry them." So they took the beeves out of Chicago, went up into Canada, came down around all the way down to Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and sold
Oh,
the meat. So there was a big stockyard actually in Manhattan. The meatpacking,
yeah.
there was a big stockyard there. They were in competition with this. So a lot of the local butchers in New York said, "Well, we're not going to sell it. It's embalmed beef. It's not good for you. Don't eat it." So Swift said, "Okay, well, what do you sell your meat for? You sell it for 10 cents a pound? I'll sell it for 9. You sell it for 9? I'll sell it for 8. You sell it for 8? I'll sell it for 6 cents.
Mhm.
You know what? I'll give it away free." And before you know it, New York was buying Chicago meat.
Yeah.
And they did the same thing on the West Coast in the San Francisco area. So they just put local butchers out of business. I mean, this was a pretty aggressive industry. That's why
Oh
there's
yeah.
always just 4 or 5 big packers because these big, economies of scale can overwhelm small companies. Now
Mhm.
today there's some small meat packers all over the countryside in Wisconsin, Iowa, Montana, but to, to compete on a global scale like these guys did, and they were ruthless. They would, okay, you want to charge 2 cents a pound? I'll give it away. Let's see whose meat they buy.
Yeah.
And they put these people out of business. And in fact, that's what they ended up doing with the livestock market also, with direct buying.
Yeah. Well, and they also did a lot of lobbying and so
Oh,
when they saw all these like the Pure Food Act and the Meat Inspection Act and all these different laws coming down the pipe, you bet you they were in the pocket of their senators and congressmen to make sure that those regulations, whatever may be, they were tailored to where at least they could, if nothing else, they could push smaller guys out.
right. Well, but first of all, so the big businesses are not so opposed to these reforms
No.
because they can handle it financially.
Yep.
But the Dominic Pacyga packing house can't, and
Yep.
so they put me out of business.
Yeah.
And so that was actually part of the response to this. Now, I mean, the Pre Food and Drug Act; those were pushed through by people like Teddy Roosevelt,
Mhm.
uh, and Upton Sinclair. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt said Upton Sinclair um, exaggerated, lied, in the book The Jungle, but he was a good tool for Teddy
Yeah.
Roosevelt because it was a public relations thing. He said, "Well, look,
Mhm.
terrible meat. All these people get sick from meat in Chicago. Why? Because there's not this, inspection and control." And it was good for the industry. Now, what's happened, of course, is that a lot of this inspection has now disappeared because the government no longer funds it. And
Yeah.
so you've got other problems now. And now this new revelation where all these kids that mostly are Latino and Asian refugees, right,
Yep.
are working in these meatpacking plants. It's like going back to 1906.
Mhm.
I
Well,
mean,
and then you have, and all these regulations are kinda based on these bigger packing plants, so when you have, like, a local mom and pop that, say, wants to sell like, say they're right on the line of, Colorado and Kansas, and
mhm,
you got a family in Kansas that wants to sell their meat in Colorado, well, now you have to have a USDA inspector for that,
sure, right,
and, because it's interstate commerce, but guess what? There's only a handful of USDA inspectors, and they're all at these giant packing houses,
right, right.
and, yeah, so it's kind of the trap of regulation, where is it good? Yes, I think it is,
Mhm.
to have these standards in place, but to have them the regulation also pushes out these smaller,
Yeah, and of course, you also want to be safe when you eat meat. You don't want something
yeah.
with maggots in it. So
Mhm. Yeah,
you
that's
know,
exactly right, and
it's a line you have to walk.
mhm.
Um, but I think that I don't know. I think in a lot of ways in the last 20, 30, 40 years, we dropped the ball on a lot of this stuff. Maybe we've got too used to it and just didn't keep it up. And but I think we need to, as a country as a whole, I think we need to rethink what we're doing and where we're going. And you and I may disagree on where that should be, but we can work something out in the middle.
Right. Well, and like I said, I didn't grow up in these like union types
Mhm.
areas, and
Right.
so I don't understand that world very much. But I do know that I love America. I
Mhm.
love this country a lot. I
Mhm.
think we're like light years above any other country on earth on the greatness of it. I like there's and that's not as a term of disrespect to anybody else in the world. I just think I think history kind of proves it. Like we've got something really, really, really fucking special here,
If we can
and
hold on to it, yeah.
right, and that means like I gotta know something about the people that are butchering that steer that I'm taking care of, to
Mhm.
get there,
Mhm.
and the people that are eating that, and like we've all got to kind of come to some sort of common understanding that like, hey, let's. And a lot of it is like, hey, don't tell me how to do my job as long as my job isn't interfering on yours. Like
Sure.
let me do mine, you do yours, and we can all have a beer after work.
Sure.
And but these corporations are, I mean, that's one thing where I really think the left wing people have always kind of been spot on. Is these giant corporations are, if I don't think they're necessarily evil. I just think when they come big enough and they're publicly traded and whatnot, there's no one guy that you can lean on to be like, hey, change your ways.
Yeah, I think that that's really true, and it's also so the McCormick Reaper Works, which then became International Harvester.
Hmm.
So when McCormick built this in Chicago, and the first Reapers came out of Chicago. He worked right on the line with his men. He knew them all by name. He knew their mothers. He knew their
Hmm.
wives. He knew the kids' names. Well, by the time it became a big corporation, nobody knew anybody.
Yep.
And it became ruthless in many kinds of ways. Not that the original McCormick wasn't ruthless. I'm sure he was in his own way.
Oh yeah.
But the fact is that so you knew John, and John got
Mm.
sick. So all right, you'll hold his job for you rather than because he's a good worker.
Yeah.
Now, if you work in a company that's got 100,000 people working for him, you don't know who's a good worker, who's a bad worker. You just know who somebody's getting in the way,
Yeah.
right? And so that anonymousness that we've created through these mass societies has caused issues, has caused problems. I mean, there's a benefit to it too. The reapers would be cheaper if they were
Hmm.
not, and then the food is cheaper. We and everybody wants cheap, right? I mean,
Yep.
even with inflation today, we really shouldn't complain too much because inflation in other countries is much higher. But
Yeah.
it's bothersome. It's worrisome. You want the cheapest, you pay the cheapest, and make the most you can. That's
Hmm.
how American culture, all cultures, to think. Um, but there does become this kind of well, even if you look in neighborhoods like I grew up, there were a lot of mom and pop grocery stores.
Hmm.
They're all gone. They're
Yeah.
all, you know, there were a lot of mom and pop butcher shops, bakery stores. I mean, I could walk to four bakers from my house.
Every small town main street too, same
Yeah,
way.
and now they're Walmart comes in and they're all gone. And then when
Hmm.
Walmart decides it doesn't make enough money, it pulls out. They just pulled
Yep.
four stores out of Chicago,
Yeah.
and neighbors, well, where are we going to shop? Well, yeah, where are you going to shop? Not my problem. And so it's a balance between individualism and communalism.
Yeah.
Caring about community or just caring about myself, you know.
Right.
And sometimes and sometimes either one of them gets skewered out of the way. You know,
Yeah. Well, like we're built on a community of individuals that threw off a monarchy. It
right.
was and then even then from like you take your family there, I don't know what your family story is, but they came from Poland. I don't know if they were fleeing or just looking for a better opportunity, but
They're looking for a better opportunity.
and so you have a group of individuals that found people like them because
Mhm.
it was a brand new world,
Mhm.
and so you have individuals that are brave enough to come over here and try to find something and make something. But in the meantime, you gotta have people that
Yeah.
or at least that you can talk to,
Sure.
and it's yeah. I think there's uh I think individual liberty is the part that we as a country, particularly on the conservative side, they always and libertarian. I'm more of on the libertarian type of
Mhm.
persuasion, and we focus on individual liberty, but not nearly enough on individual responsibility. Like you
Well,
have responsibility to take care of people that are within your orbit.
sure. You have a responsibility to your neighbors. You don't want to put a cesspool in your backyard. You know?
Yeah. Well, and
Or,
that
no.
that old Robert Frost, good fences make good neighbors.
Right.
It's something so profound about that. Is like a good fence between you and your neighbor is a good thing, but you still got to have like when you come from that part of the world where you a good fence means like your cattle ain't in with the neighbor cattle, but it's not necessarily because you don't. It's keeping your business separate, but you got to
Mhm.
be able to help each other out when disaster strikes, and that's one of the beauties of like rural communities is when you get a big weather event, whether it's a blizzard or a flood or whatever, like people band together and help each other out because you always want when something bad happens to you, you want to hope that your neighbor will be there to give you a hand.
Sure. Sure.
And I don't know, it's just that's the individual responsibility is a lot left out a lot when people are talking about, the liberty part of things. And
Yeah.
I believe in individual liberty, kind of almost above all, but like, liberty comes with responsibility. That's why I always say
Absolutely.
freedom isn't free.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I think a lot of people have lost sight of that. And
Mhm.
I so I it's I don't know, it's always good, when you see like a company doing something good to give back to the community. Like I'll support them. I don't care if they're that they're a bigger outfit. If they're
Sure.
helping the community around them, that's a good thing. And like the people I work for, the company I work for, like they donate like a lot of beef to the FFA kids are putting on a fundraiser or something. We'll donate the beef to that. Why
Sure.
not? Help them out. One of those kids might come work for us.
Sure. Yeah.
And it's a self-interested thing, but it's the right thing to do as well.
Sure.
And
Absolutely.
so I think you're right that there there's something about a strong community that's I mean that used to be what the like I said the waves of history through the US. There's strife and then everybody kind of gets along, and when everybody gets along, man, we do some really cool stuff.
Right. Put a man
And
on the moon.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean that they built the transatlantic railroad, which
Mhm.
allowed and it gave guys that had just been fighting each other, it gave them a place to go
Yeah.
and do something. Because once the war was over, a lot of those, a lot of the northern guys went back up to their jobs or in their homes and their farms, but a lot of those southern guys, they just had nothing left to go back to, like
Mhm.
nothing at all, and they went west. The freed slaves, all of a sudden, they're just kind of there.
Yeah.
What do we do now? And all they know how to do is work. So, well, let's go find work. And these railroads, these packing houses, it gave a lot of disenfranchised men something to do, and it gave them another purpose in life, and that and it creates strong communities. I mean, it really
Yeah.
really helped make America great. Just like I don't know. It's fascinating. I love that history period, post World War or Civil War, the Great Western Expansion. It's just it's such a fascinating period in time where it's kind of like I guess it's the race to the modern age almost.
Yeah, and I think that's where the stockyards come in too. I mean, they create the modern age in many ways,
Hmm.
and the railroads and the technology that emerges.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I don't know. I guess kind of to wrap it all up, I hate to take too much more of your time. But that you kind of told that story of Chicago with the Union Stockyards in your book Slaughterhouse, in a way that I hadn't heard told quite before. You had I've read the Jungle several different times, starting in high school, and then I reread it doing some research for this project, and then I'm reading like, do you know the name Roger Scheel? I think is his last Shiel. He was a commission guy from Indianapolis,
Mm.
and he was one of the biggest movers of cattle, and he wrote I just read it was kind of a rambling set of letters, and I don't know, but he was kind of railing against the beef trust, and then there's a butcher that wrote a treatise on the beef trust,
Mm.
or the dark side of the beef trust, or something like that, and it's a lot of just muckraking, and yours just told the story of how it all happened rather than trying to point fingers, and it's a good story, and there's no like I think a lot of people get involved with trying to push a bias or an agenda, but rather than just tell the damn story. And I think that's what you
Well, thank you.
managed to do with Slaughterhouse, and I enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and so I appreciate this conversation. I'd love to have you back on again the further I get into this research, and kind of kick some ideas back and forth with you. And I'm trying to figure out a time I can get to Chicago, because I'm going to take you up on that offer.
Well, you got my email and you got my phone number. Give me a ring.
Yes, sir. Well, Dominic, I appreciate your time. It was been a really good chat, and thanks everybody for tuning in. And yeah, move your ass. We're burning daylight.
Your eyes up in the morning, beneath the stars so bright. Pull your hat down, make sure your cinch is tight. Horses kinda snuffy, cold chill up your spine. We'll get your ass moving, son, we're burning daylight. Burning daylight. Burning daylight. In the saddle till the job's done right. Burning daylight. Well, life is just a gather, and you won't catch 'em all. But when you ride through the gate, make sure you sit up tall. I can see the horizon, it's looking pretty bright. Well, get your ass moving, son, we're burning daylight. Burning daylight. Burning daylight. In the saddle till the job's done right.